On this week's episode of Where We Are, we have a very special conversation with Luke Russert, author of the New York Times bestselling book, Look for Me There, Grieving My Father, Finding Myself. I can't wait for you to hear this conversation. You're listening to Where We Are.
Hey friends, I want to tell you about another show on That Sounds Fun Network, and it might be the most fun you have listening to a podcast. What happens when two friends who love snacks and have mostly differing opinions enter the chat? Welcome to the Snack Show with Jamie and Fallon, who love laughing as much as they love food. Follow along as they live their motto, live, laugh, snack. Jamie Crockett is a displaced West Coast girl living in Nashville, Tennessee, and Fallon Klug is a Midwest girl making her way in the South by way of New York City. And one of the ways to their hearts is through snacks. Name a snack and they probably have an episode. Oreos, gluten-free, holiday snacks, fair snacks, amusement snacks, Cracker Barrel snacks, you name it, they're talking about it. And fun fact, Michael and I are joining Jamie and Fallon this coming July on the Snack Show to talk about some super special snacks. So it's a Where We Are Snack Show podcast smash up that you will not want to miss. The Snack Show releases 30-minute episodes every Friday, and it's the perfect and delicious way to end your week.
This is Where We Are. We are the Wares. I'm Michael.
I'm Melissa.
Bills Mafia! Buffalo!
We've been waiting for an excuse to have a podcast where we're talking about the Bills more in depth, but not just between ourselves, but with someone else, also a huge Bills fan.
This has been a great week in Buffalo history. Josh Allen, cover of Madden. Luke Russert on Where We Are.
Yes.
They broke ground on the new Bills Stadium.
I know, it's so exciting.
I mean, huge week for Buffalo. Mm-hmm. To all of our listeners from Buffalo, thanks for listening. But this conversation is for everyone. Luke has written a book that literally seems to be for everyone. It's hit the New York Times bestseller list. And covers, penetrating themes, grief, faith, relationships, not just with his father, but with his mother, and politics, of course.
Class, family dynamics.
Yes. And the universal subject of Buffalo, New York.
Yes.
Well, Melissa, anything folks should know before they listen to the interview with Luke?
I know you've all heard me say that I don't cry a lot, but the first chapter of this book, I cried. It's really moving writing, unbelievable. So you'll dive right in, and for anybody who's lost someone, especially with Father's Day coming up, this book is a great gift for a dad in your life. Or if you are also on a grief journey like Luke is, it's a good gift for yourself. And so I just want you to know that before you dive into it, before we get to it.
Yeah.
I think you're going to enjoy it.
Yeah. Before we hop to the interview, let me just read you Luke's bio so that you know who we're, all the details of who we're talking to. Luke Russert is an author, an Emmy Award-winning journalist who served as an NBC News correspondent from 2008 to 2016, primarily covering American politics. Luke was seen on popular outlets such as NBC Nightly News, Today, NBCNews.com, and MSNBC. After leaving media, Russert embarked on a 3-year, 6-continent travel expedition that took him to nearly 70 countries. Published by Harper Horizon, his first book, Look for Me There, Grieving My Father, Finding Myself, is a reflection of his deeply personal internal journey across many diverse external places. He is the son of the late Tim Russert of NBC's Meet the Press and Vanity Fair writer Maureen Orth. Russert resides in Washington, D.C. with his pug named Shakimo.
Shakimo.
Shakmo? We didn't
We should
talk
have asked
about.
Luke.
Yeah, we
Sorry,
didn't talk
Luke,
about
if
the
we
pup.
just
Yeah, if we
butchered
just
your pug's name.
yeah. But that's Luke, and here's our conversation with him. I think you're going to enjoy it.
Hello, Where We Are listeners. If you're a longtime fan of this podcast or you're just joining us for the first time today, we want to tell you more about our podcast platform called Spotify for Podcasters. We've been using this platform for over a year, and it's been easy to use, and new features are added all the time. You can record and edit podcasts from your phone or computer. You don't need anything fancy, and you don't need previous podcast experience. When you hit publish, you will distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify if that's your kind of thing. And with Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. But here's the thing, you can earn money, but it's a free platform. There's no catch. If you're curious or want to see what it's all about, download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
Luke, so good to have you with us on Where We Are. There's a lot of Buffalo on the podcast this episode.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's a very sharp jersey.
Yeah. I figured my Josh Allen jersey take us into the next season. Hey, so grateful to have you with us. You, the new book is fantastic. Just what recently announced that made the New York Times bestseller list, and we're happy to have you on to talk about it. Where I want to start the conversation is where you open up the book. For Melissa and I are both from Buffalo. You're as you write about so movingly in the book. Your father loomed so large in our lives growing up. I come from an Italian Catholic family. And I think our experience was not unlike many others, which is if you were Catholic and in Buffalo, there was a portrait of the Virgin Mary on like the mantle, and there was a copy of Big Russ and Me on the bookshelf, and that's just what it was. And
That's
so
great.
for
Great.
those who, can you just tell us a bit about your father, the public figure, and then tell us about your father as your father, as just open up for readers a bit about the relationship you and your dad had.
Yeah, sure. And thank you so much for having me on the program. I think most folks knew my dad as the very public, forward-facing moderator of Meet the Press on NBC News, and that was a job he held for 17 years. He found great success in that position. It was the number one Sunday morning political affairs talk show for quite a long time. And he really used that position to be an ardent defender of democracy and also explain the political process for people. He saw it as his patriotic duty. And through all of that, he never forgot where he came from, which was Buffalo. And it was the civility and the decorum that he had learned in Buffalo about how to relate to folks and just be an all-around good neighbor, good person, that really shone through his broadcast style. And I think that's why a lot of folks trusted him, is that they knew that he was there on behalf of them, asking questions for them. And that was very important. For all the success he had and for as competitive as he was, there was no ego. He was always mindful that he was the son of a garbage man in South Buffalo, for a guy who worked 2 jobs for 40 years, who also drove a delivery truck. And he carried that with him. And I think what's so interesting and unique to look back on, at least for me, was in the writing process, was I began to sort of understand how he carried those lessons from Buffalo, and it was a good chip on his shoulder. What I mean by that is that he would go into these rooms with all these very slick Ivy League guys and these people who were politicians to the nth degree and whatnot, and to sort of bring in that Rust Belt sensibility and never apologize for it, and also never apologize for his Catholic faith. He went to Canisius High School in Buffalo, then I'm going to John Carroll University in Cleveland, 2 great Jesuit places. And those were
Yeah.
very important in the formation of his professional self. Is that he was a man of faith and virtue, and believed that you had to bring that sense of honesty and objectivity to the job, and have boundaries and have values. And then that was very beneficial for him. And for me, he was dad. And I talk about how I didn't really know the enormity of his position until I was probably 9, 10 years old, where I was like, I don't
Mm-hmm.
see the other kids' dads on that little box every Sunday morning or during the week on the news. And people would walk by restaurant tables and people would whisper, "Oh, that's Tim Russert. That's Tim Russert." And so it was then that I sort of began to understand that. But I always just sort of saw him as my best friend and my mentor and someone who was looking out for me and who cared. And the greatest thing my father ever gave me was the gift of time. And for as busy as he was, which I didn't appreciate until I worked in the industry myself, was
Yeah.
he was always willing to give me time. And if he had to rearrange his schedule, if something came up, he always made sure that that time would occur somewhere else. So he would say, "Hey, I'm
Yeah.
so sorry this got blown up. I'll make it up to you," and he always did. So I trusted him, and I trusted that. And it was honest time too. A lot of my friends now have children, and I go, the one piece of advice I give you is you can hang out with your kids, but if you're on your phone the entire time, they pick up on that. So you
Yeah.
got to be engaged with them, and
Yeah.
it's so very important. But yeah, it was a wonderful dad to have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. And the book opens really movingly on the day that he passed, and
Mm-hmm.
you sort of track the trajectory of those first hours and those days. You were actually with your mom in Florence,
Yeah.
and we'll want to talk about your mom as we
Mm-hmm.
as we move forward. But yeah, you give the eulogy at your dad's funeral, and you kind of describe how that sort of uh, maybe not just the eulogy, but just the course of events led to all of a sudden conversations with executives. You ended up doing an interview with Larry King, and it was in some ways uh, I don't know if you describe it as the start or escalation of your own career in journalism. And so, what was that? How how conscious how consciously were you following or seeking to follow in your father's footsteps, or was it only reflecting back that you sort of put those things together and wondered sort of whether you really loved the job you were doing, or whether it was doing what you saw your dad do?
So I graduated from college 3 weeks before he had passed away.
Yeah.
And it's kind of surreal that I was this sort of happy go lucky kid, probably going to take a gap year, get ready to go to graduate school, do some traveling, do some volunteering. And that was sort of what I envisioned. And a few days after he passed, I'm giving the eulogy, and there was Barack Obama and John McCain and Joe Biden and Ethel Kennedy and Dick Cheney are all there in the first few rows. And uh, it's one of those surreal moments where you find the strength in a higher power, and then you sort of internalize the craft, and you come to a place of, all right, I got to do this for dad. I have to do this for my family. And I
Mm-hmm.
gave that speech privately first at the closed funeral at Holy Trinity Catholic Church, and then I gave a variation of it again at the Kennedy Center at my father's public memorial, which was broadcast live on television. And it was after that that television executives and people said, "Oh, this is a young guy. He's well spoken. He's got a great last name. We should do something with him and whatnot." And part of that, I think, was continuing Tim's legacy. There's similar attributes, there's similar style, there's similar looks, etc., and it brings comfort to people.
Mm,
But I was under no, I was not naive and under some idea that there would not be charges of nepotism and that people would,
Mm-hmm.
sure.
would be upset about it. And so I understood that. My mom, to her credit, said to me, "You got to make this decision on your own. I can't push you in one way or another." But what you have to understand is that you're going to take a lot of incoming and just be prepared for that. But on the other hand, it's your name. You're allowed to use it the way you want to. Okay.
Yeah.
So I thought about it and I ended up sort of splitting the difference. What I mean by that is I said, okay, I'll do this for 1 year. And I said, no, let's just do a 1 year deal, see how it works out. And if it doesn't work out, then no harm, no foul. And I ended up enjoying the first few months, but then there was a lull after the election and the inauguration because youth issues, which I covered, they had kind of gone away. And so I had some time left in my deal, and I said, hey, look, you guys are short staffed in the Capitol. Just let me do some stuff up there off air and just start reporting on subcommittee hearings that no one cares about in the middle of the night. And I started to do that offline and for the website and not on camera. And it was really beneficial. And as I started to do that, I started to gain some confidence. And then they said, hey, why don't you do some weekend radio and some weekend spots and see how it goes? And I did well at that and ended up parlaying that into being a congressional correspondent for a number of years and found my footing in that capacity. But I didn't envision myself following my father's footsteps like that. I think that was to some degree divine intervention, the universe, and whatever you want to call it. But I always thought that if I were to go into media, it'd be more of the sports route or more of the long form route, not network news. And that was very close to the sun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do that part of the book where you're talking about working on the Hill. The story that you have with then Speaker John Boehner, I found to be hilarious. Of Boehner sort of sitting you down and talking with you through, do you want to stay here on the Hill? I found that to be so interesting.
Well, it kind of reminded me of the joke that President Obama and Boehner did for the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where Boehner's sort of giving Obama advice about life after the White House. And so I was like, oh, this is
maybe this is a pattern.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a pattern for John Boehner. But anyways, that part of the book for our listeners who gotten by it, I just some comedic relief there of I could envision exactly John Boehner's, the way he was sitting there and talking to you. It was very funny. But, we've talked about your dad a bit, and another person, and you've mentioned her, that obviously is a huge influence in your life is your mother. And in a lot of ways, obviously, this book is about you and your grief, losing your father, trying to find yourself, find your own path in life. But I also just couldn't help but notice that this book is also about understanding your mom better as an adult. The one parent who, is still with you and is walking life with you, that it's about, I see that you come into greater understanding of her. What does she think about the book and the experiences that you had?
Well, my mom is the best writer in the family. She's a writer for Vanity Fair magazine. Yeah. So the first thing is you're incredibly nervous to show your own writing, and I actually didn't do that for quite a while. I held back. Part of that was also because I write about our relationship, and I didn't want that to be blown up before I was further along in the process in case she didn't like anything. And of course, there's parts of it she didn't like, but that's what you have to endure when you're a writer. But she's a very interesting person. And let me sort of say that one of the great joys about writing this book, but also the journey that I took when I left NBC and started traveling, was I got to understand her independent of the role mom. And I think that sometime we all go through this exercise where our parents become mortal and we understand who they are independent of mom or dad. And we get to appreciate, okay, what were they like before they were married? What were they like before they had us? Right? And who are they really as human beings, independent of these exalted roles, which we have them for better or for worse. And I never really understood that about my mom until I was in my early 30s and I started to travel with her. She was a young woman who had graduated from Cal Berkeley. And at the time, in the 60s, women were kind of steered towards being nurses or teachers, and she wanted to do something else. She's like, I those aren't for me. I want adventure. And so her dad, who was pretty domineering, said like, well, you can't do that. A woman doesn't just go off on adventures. So I'm going to join the Peace Corps. And she goes, okay, you can do that. So she joined the Peace Corps and ended up building those rural schools in Colombia outside of Medellin. And found great success with that and really enjoyed it and had this sort of thirst for adventure because she felt when she traveled, she was measuring herself up against the world and would end up learning a lot about herself. And she ended up pushing that into writing and became one of the first female correspondents at Newsweek magazine and worked her way up to Vanity Fair and Vogue and had a bunch of really incredible success and was, highly regarded and still is.
Yes.
Yeah.
But what I found is with her growing up is she was this sort of bad cop to my dad being the good cop. And she was much more of the disciplinarian.
Yeah.
If something was a B plus, why wasn't it an A minus? If it was an A minus, why wasn't it an A? There was never sort of a sense you could ever satisfy mom. She was always tough. And it wasn't until I traveled with her and I saw the degree of which she threw herself into these foreign countries and cultures and was fearless and domineering in a good way, just sort of always asking questions and always never letting anything just settle. It was sort of, wait, why is that the way it is? I go, oh, all right. Well, now I understand her parenting style is that
Yeah.
she was very gung ho. She was very sort of always moving forward, but she also realized the value of hard work. And I could see easily why she thought I would have been spoiled as a kid, or that dad spoils you too much, or, you're not working hard enough, which I thought was crazy as a young man because I started working summer jobs when I was 14, moving freight and delivering pizzas. Like I always had to get good grades or I would get like grounded. Like I thought I've been working hard, my entire life. But
Yes,
for
yes,
her, it was like a constant, almost to the degree of a Jesuit priest. Like, have you done enough? That fuel.
Uh-huh.
And it wasn't until I saw her travel that I really understood, okay, I get this now. That's why she was hard on me, in my opinion. I realize now she was just trying to make me a more well-rounded person, and maybe thought, oh, dad gives it to him too easy. I have to be somebody that enforces a little bit more discipline. But it was a lesson that, honestly, gosh, I mean, would not have come without traveling and seeing her outside of the environment that had been built up for so many years. That's the sort of beauty of travel is you begin to process things that become much more aware, that you become more aware of because you're not in the daily doldrums. It's sort of, oh, I now see mom in a new light, like literally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also like this sense, and there's a lot of danger. I mean, there's just a lot of, your story, Luke, and I'm sure you get this all the time, especially from people from Buffalo and who relate. There's just so many commonalities, at least that sort of I feel. There's also like this sense that like the world can be an unforgiving place.
Mhm.
And I was interested in all the different ways in which your parents and you relate to uh, a working class background, and for you like a working class sort of ethic, like that is in some ways even detached from your own circumstances. There's just
Yeah.
like a working class ethos,
Mhm.
to the extent where like you're worrying on the trip, like uh, is this too self-indulgent? Like who am I to discover myself? Like who like you ask these really interesting questions. Can you reflect a bit on the way that sort of working class, the working class ethos sort of both lifts and emboldens, as you said, with your father, like a sort of positive chip on your shoulder, but on his shoulder, but also the ways in which it can direct you in ways that you may not want to be directed.
Sure. There was two things that my father used to always say. One is that you're always loved, but you're never entitled, and that
Yeah.
it's nice to be important, but it's more important to be nice. And
Yeah.
I've always tried to live those two sayings to the best of my ability. I've not always done it perfectly. I have certainly failed, but they've always been imprinted in the front of my mind to some degree. And I think what's very interesting is you do feel that Buffalo ethos, which is there's two components to it. One is the value in showing up, that people are depending on you and you're depending on others. So
Mhm.
there's a lot to be said about that. My grandfather retired with all his sick days. when he retired from the Buffalo Sanitation
Yeah,
Department. And they said, well, why don't you, those are your sick days. Why don't you take them? Because, well, I wasn't sick. Right. And so that was something I've always remembered, growing up way differently, having much more privileged life, going to private schools and never having to worry to the degree they did. And the other component of it that I think is so important, especially as it pertains to Buffalo, is this idea of looking out for your neighbor. And I think that's something my dad would always do, whether it was sort of the literal with charity, but just in terms of like, hey, maybe something is going on with this guy. It's not okay. Not being a busybody, not, intruding on someone, but saying, hey, everything good? You all right? You're right. And it was after he died that I got these letters from so many people that would say, there was a difficult period in my life where I may have lost somebody, or I was going through a divorce, or I'd lost my job, and your dad just called me, or took me out to dinner, or some people say even made a car payment for me, and I always paid him back. And then things like that just blew me away. And that's Buffalo, helping out your neighbor at its core. But I think what's so interesting now is we live in this society that's like so fragmented, and people kind of look at some of these older values as like they're old fashioned, and it's like no, they're not old fashioned. There's something to be said about an honest day's work, and there's something to be said about showing up and putting your best foot forward. And I remember, I'll never forget, like one day I was going to school and I had grass stains on my khakis. I went to this private school. My dad said, "What the hell are those?" And I was like, "I don't know. I was playing flag football yesterday, and you're shipping." He said, "Hey, you can't wear those. You look dirty." And I was like, "Well, who cares?" I said, "Kids wear it all the time." He said, "No. He goes, that reflects badly on us. You can't do that." And so I have to go home and change, and I'm late to school, and I get in trouble, so I have to show up Saturday morning at 6 a.m. That's what our punishment was. And so then like years go by and kind of lose sight of that. And we're sitting at dinner in Buffalo, and my grandfather starts talking. He didn't talk a lot, but he started talking about how he was so proud to see my dad, his son, take the bus, and that his pants were always ironed, and he always looked like he was ready to go to work. And I was like, I remember where that comes from now. I get that. That's it's the value in showing up and doing it the right way.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Yeah, I think you've just captured Buffalo in ways that we are constantly trying to describe to people of what it's like to grow up in Buffalo with those kinds of values, and how the moniker, the city of good neighbors, when you sort of say it enough and you actually see it modeled enough, it is something that's sort of built into a community, and it's such a strange model of community cohesion. But talking about these values, these kinds of values, one of the things that I also noticed in the book is that quite a few times you talk about forgiveness. It's in several different places in the book. So how did your travels impact your views on forgiveness?
Oh, that's a very good question. So one of the things you see in the book is I go to these countries that are very much a testament to forgiveness. Whether it's Rwanda, where there was a horrific genocide where hundreds of thousands of people were killed seemingly overnight between warring tribes that ultimately were Rwandan. They just had different ethnic backgrounds, and that country today is a wonderful success story because of forgiveness. Saw the same thing in Japan and Hiroshima. I mean, here's a place where the United States dropped an atomic bomb, killed hundreds of thousands of people almost immediately, and I was welcomed there, and their favorite pastime is American baseball. Vietnam, another example of that. So you see a lot of these countries that I would think would be predisposed to be either angry at America, or in the case of Rwanda, angry at each other, and realize that there's got to be reconciliation. Because if you're going to survive together, you have to at least be willing to understand one another and get over a few things. And I picked that up along my travels. I was somebody who, my entire life, we like to say, we don't hold grudges, but the Irish always hold the grudge to some degree, right? But it made me a more forgiving person. And what I mean by that is I became aware of like so many of these things that we get so worked up about in the United States. I mean, they don't really matter to the degree that we think they do. And I speak to that. It's like when you go to places and you see how people get by on so little, and
Yeah.
just how much abundance there is in the United States, even with all the issues we have. Um, it's humbling. It's humbling, and it makes you think like, you know what, I'm not going to honk at that guy in traffic today. It's just it's not needed. There's way worse things going on.
Mhm.
But also my own life, it pushed me to really think about how I lived. And what I mean by that is, if I felt someone had wronged me or written something nasty about me or something like that, I would hold that for a long time.
Yeah.
Then after I traveled and I saw the level of forgiveness that people were willing to have around the world for some really terrible, serious atrocities, the light went off in my mind. I was like, it's this live and let live. Like forgiveness makes you feel much better. And then lo and behold, you come to realize throughout traveling, especially with the Abrahamic religions in the Holy Land, like, they're all based on forgiveness. That's the whole point. Right? So there's a reason why turn the other cheek existed.
Yeah.
And you see it
Yeah.
in Judaism, you see it in Islam, and then also you see it in Buddhism and Hinduism. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah,
Yes.
you're taking me just where I wanted to go, which
Yep.
is you tell this. So I did religious outreach on Barack Obama's two campaigns, and so I was really
Good for you.
interested to read a story that you open up with in the book. It's in the one of the first stories that you talk about reporting on that aired on Andrea Mitchell's Hour on MSNBC about you found a group of young Muslim women
Yeah.
who really identified with then candidate Obama, and then we see that theme, as you just alluded to, come up
Mhm.
as a Catholic, who's someone who strongly identifies as Catholic and finds great meaning in your own Catholic faith. You also have these encounters with sometimes incredibly meaningful and personally moving encounters with other religious traditions. Can you reflect on that? I mean, it is a very Jesuit thing. So it's the Jesuit formation is shining through. But can you talk about your exposure or greater engagement with other religious traditions and what that meant to you on your travels?
Sure. I mean, faith is a very large component of the book, and it's done in a way of the old idea of we're all trying to get to the same place. We just take different roads to get there, right? And the same place is basically some element of peace and understanding and acceptance and forgiveness and just being well rounded and a good person.
Mhm.
So I would always find comfort in places of faith, whether it was a cathedral or a mosque or a synagogue or a temple. I was interesting and I found it comforting. And what I realized over the course of traveling was I began to understand way more about my own faith by exploring others. The
Yes.
seminal moment for this is in Cambodia, where I actually pray with a group of monks, Buddhist monks in a monastery. And you learn in the Buddhist religion the whole idea of embracing the suffering. And in the Jesuit sense, in Catholicism, there's this thing called the Jesuit Examen, which is a
Yeah.
sort of daily reflection about, where you were good, where you were bad, what did you perceive, what did you understand of the day. And I immediately saw that the meditation you see in Buddhism is so similar to that Jesuit Examen. And then ultimately the idea of, especially the Jesuit faith, is that there are difficult times and you have to live in those difficult times, but understand that have faith that you will get through and that this is sort of the way of the world.
Yes.
And I became much more understanding of that after sitting with these Buddhist monks and understanding the idea of embracing suffering. And when you say embracing suffering, people take that very literally. And I always caution against that. I said, Buddhists are not saying like, pinch yourself and hurt yourself and like, yes, I'm embracing the suffering now. It's no. It's that the daily back and forth of life, there is an element of suffering because there's so much unknown. People die, people get sick, people get upset, etc. But life goes on, and you have to be comfortable in that uncertainty. And if you can reach a comfort in that uncertainty, then you'll be okay. It's the same thing in Catholicism, right? It's the mystery of faith, right? Once you are comfortable within that mystery of faith and you're
Yes.
trusting in the mystery of faith, everything becomes clear and everything becomes easier. And it's in each religion that I learned about has a path to get there in some capacity, right? Part of it is just having this ultimate faith, and some people take that to extreme ways. But most of them are this understanding, be aware, notice things, and you'll get to that place of peace. And I thought that was really, really interesting, because if you get
Yeah.
back to sort of our primordial selves, right, like man and fire and sun, right, and then comes back this idea of peace, right, understanding and serenity. Yeah, it's interesting.
No, yeah, for sure. I mean, if we were going to literally embrace suffering, we'd all be Buffalo Bills fans.
That's right. That's a good line. I want to steal that.
Yeah. I I want to go back to, well, you come back to it in the book. If you don't mind, we'll just a few more questions. I want to zoom out a bit. You reflect. You had a story that was going to go on air, but you got bumped because of Harambe. And you're right that you knew sort of, and this was during sort of Trump's rise. You just knew that news media was going to be different. And there's a line, something like entertainment had overcome substance.
Sure. Yeah.
Can you reflect? And then in another part, you reflect the owner of the Steak and Egg Diner, who told you it was your father who taught him what it meant to be an American. And so there's this sort of like Harambe news media, and then there's like news media as civic education, and as there's politics as low entertainment. But it's really clear from your book there's still an appreciation for like the high entertainment of politics. That politics can be beautiful, like Governor Cuomo, Mario Cuomo, really believed this, and your dad exemplified it. Can you reflect on the politics as entertainment sort of idea? Do you think that we're now in a place where news media is sort of inherently degrading the political process, or do you think that there's still a potential for an ennobling journalism covering politics, and a citizenry who are prepared to engage politics as something more than entertainment?
Yeah, I would start off with one of the interesting things about the last month with this book being out is the level of nostalgia that people have for my dad. And a lot of that's nostalgia for how politics was covered in the past. And when he died, it was really the end of an era. And what I mean by that, it was the end of the morning news, evening news, daily, normal cable, and print newspapers that still had quite a wide circulation. The internet news was coming up, and there was a lot of it there, but it was not nearly as in your face as it is today with smartphones, with Twitter, with Instagram, with TikTok, whatever social media is out there. So I think people see just how far off Mount Olympus we have fallen in that sense, and think back to guys like my father and Cronkite, and think, man, like that was a time where there was much more civility. People had a certain level of decorum, and people focused on real substantive, important issues, much more fact based. And I think what's ended up happening since then are a few things. Is one, there is just this, man bites dog mentality of get something that's obscure and odd and follow it because it gets eyeballs. Or there's this idea of, well, if it's on Twitter, it must be a big deal. It's only 25% of America's on Twitter. It's not. There's a really larger world out there. And I think that dilutes what people in newsrooms are focusing on, and that's a problem. The second part of it is that we now live in such a fragmented society, and a lot of that is just awful polarization, where people have become distrustful of things they used to trust, whether that's something of the church, whether that's of government, or especially media. And you see people that cocoon themselves in their own media ecosystems, not really wanting to hear something that they don't like, and that's a
Yeah.
problem. I think for me, one of the things you mentioned there at Harambe was I had one foot out the door with NBC. I didn't know if I was going to stay. I was still trying to making the call, and I had done this story about a veteran story on Capitol Hill, a veterans bill. It ended up getting bumped for Donald Trump's reaction to the shooting death of Harambe the gorilla, and it was one of those moments where I was like, all right, the universe is saying this is a good time to get out and reevaluate things. But on a more serious note, it's like we got to figure out a way in which those stories will get their sugar high moments, but that ultimately come down to things that are more important. And people will say, "Oh, it's boring. It's boring." It's like, well, here's how I would challenge that: is one of the things that I noticed traveling is that we often try to put things in sort of black and white categories, but the world's very gray. America's very gray. Everything there's a lot of nuance in issues, a la what you were talking about before. Young Muslim women supporting Barack Obama, but not sure if they can really do that publicly because that might be problematic for him as a candidate. Okay, that's a nuanced report. You got to explain the different reasons as to why that is. Why would these girls be scared? Okay, they don't want to be labeled as Islamic extremists in the context of an American political campaign, but should they be? They're just as American as you and I. They were born here, they grew up here. There's a lot of elements to that story. And oftentimes, especially in the social media world, we just blow right past that because it's instantaneous, sugar high, sugar high, sugar high. But if you explain the nuance, I do think there is an audience that's receptive to that. And 60 Minutes is a great example of it. Like 60 Minutes takes the moment and takes the time to try to explain an issue to the best of their abilities. I mean, they're still hamstrung a little bit by time. And that's really what my dad did. My dad had 24-minute segments, 31-minute segments where he would have a conversation with a policymaker and press them about policy. The policy was often the first thing that was spoken about. It was only the personal was only brought in if it would have a negative impact on the policy, basically saying, is your personal life or things that you've done personally going to have a negative impact where you would not be able to govern? Because ultimately what you're trying to do is be the representative of the people. People are putting their trust into you. And these are things that I think a lot of people understand and a lot of people gravitate to. But we as a society, unfortunately, are just there's this sort of dumbing down where there's this focus on silly stories or things that really what's the magnitude of them, and we don't know. And I tell this story, which is funny. I had this wonderful write up in People magazine a few weeks before the book came out, and there were two covers to People. There was one which was the royal wedding, and one which is like an American crime story. And I was like, wow, there's two covers. I go, what sells better, the royal wedding or the American crime story? And they're like, well, these are two things that sell. That's why you put them on the cover. But usually it's like the American crime story. And I'm like, oh gosh. And it's like, you think about that. It's like, oh yeah, I understand why it's appealing to people. I understand why people, because everyone's like, oh, who did it? But there's so many crimes every single day. Like we seem to focus in on the few of these that sort of have the same actors in them, right? And do we do that to where we don't focus on more substantive, important issues? And it's tough because ultimately it's a ratings business, it's a readership business, it's an engagement business. But I do think we would be well served for some people to stand up and be like, I want to be able, if nothing else, just have time to tell a story in its complexities in its entirety. And God bless the streaming services, because I do think that they're in that space to a degree. They want to be. But then you have the other component, which is finding the people who can actually tell them accurately.
Yeah. No. Sure. The last substantive question. I have a book that'll come out at the beginning of next year on spiritual formation in public life. And one way of reading your book is this sort of journey of spiritual formation that you're refined by your travels, by your experiences. Do you think that experiences like yours, do you think that um, spiritual formation, um, uh, uh, going deeper into oneself and thinking about the kind of person you're becoming, and then working on that, do you think that our public life needs that, or uh, like where would you place your story in the broader political scene and what we're seeing unfold, especially as this 2024 race
It's an
keeps
interesting question. I mean, one of the things that I've been outspoken about for quite a long time, I think especially pertains to Catholicism and politics, is we have oftentimes a group of bishops that hone in on one or two specific issues in Catholic doctrine, where there's about 100 more that, at least at their surface level, are considered as important as the ones that are honed in on, right?
Yeah.
And you see that too in other faiths. And I think that we have pigeonholed people of faith into either thinking, you take whatever the doctrine is in its totality, and that's the type of voter you are. And so we as politicians are going to speak to that. And again, I go back to nuance. That's crazy. I've met very few pure Catholic voters that vote in Catholic doctrine in its entirety. I think someone asked me, like, which politician is the closest to that. It's probably Bob Casey of Pennsylvania in terms of like trying to vote the Catholic side of every single issue, but they don't really exist because for everyone who's quote unquote pro life, then they support the death penalty, right? Or they don't listen to the Pope's encyclical about poverty or climate change. It's forgotten. So it's very interesting how all that works. I think for me, though, in terms of spirituality in the political sense, is one of the things you learn abroad is there's you see how fast people can use religion to divide, and you see how fast people can do that and get to the really negative aspects of it. And that is and that's sad. But you see how it happens, and oftentimes it's like there's either an extreme group or a marginalized group, and then religion gets brought into it, and then it sort of splits people's differences. So they end up falling into the more extreme category they really think they are because they got to hold on to one aspect of it. And if you lose that one thing, we're going to lose the whole house, etc. So that's sort of something where I think in a country like the United States, where we have the ability to talk through things, we should be much more conscious.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely see that. I would actually love to continue on that, but we're going to stop with the substantive questions and we're going to get really deep here.
Okay.
Bills. We have to talk the Bills. You're a huge Buffalo Bills fan. We're obviously huge Buffalo Bills fans.
Is the window closing, Luke?
No.
Here's
the thing. Like, people say there's the window closing. We forget we were in the wilderness for 20 years. Okay. It was a long time. It was a long time in the wilderness. So as long as Joshua Allen is around and playing quarterback for the Buffalo Bills, we have a chance to do something. That's the way the league works, right? I do think we'll have to get creative with the salary cap in the coming years. We just certainly need to hit on these draft picks. But I think if you look at the way the league is there's anyone has a chance any single given year if you have a quarterback, and we'll be okay on that front. I like this year though. I think this year is shaping up really well for us. We're not the hunted this year. All the attention's on the Jets, all the attention's on the Dolphins. That's fine by me. Please put them 1 and 2 in every single column, every single preseason prediction. That's great. I'd love to be there. I think last year we lose sight of everything the Bills had to go through. You had the horrific racist mass shooting at the tops of Buffalo in May, and there's no other team that personifies community like the Bills do for Buffalo, so they felt that, literally. You had Mrs. Pagula's health diagnosis, which was very difficult. Some people knew about it at the time, some people did not. You had 2 blizzards that shut down the city, that killed one of them severely, wreaked havoc on neighborhoods and killed fellow Buffalonians. And of course, you have what happened to Damar Hamlin, literally dying on the
Yep.
field and brought back to life. So throughout all of that, the team won 13 games
Yes.
and won a playoff game. And I think, honest to God, if you watch the last one against Cincinnati, they just ran out of gas. I think they were emotionally spent. It was not the same team from earlier in the year. It wasn't like Cincinnati played a different style of football or was executing better. The Bills just looked like they had that win against Miami in the playoffs. That took everything out of them. So I think we should be optimistic. And if next year is 11 wins, I mean, I'm reading these message boards like, well, 11 wins, that would be a failure. Are you kidding? Where were you? Where were you? Especially these young kids. There's like these 15-year-old kids. I was like, you don't remember. You don't remember what it was like in the 2000s. Okay, like we'll take 11 wins every year. That's fine. Like
for sure. Meaningful football in December is
meaningful football. Not to have to be in the hunt all the time. My God, there's a 15-year period of being perpetually in the hunt. But I think the team's they have a really good chance this year. We'll see what they can do. Obviously they hopefully stay healthy. But it's fun. I mean, that's the one thing that I tell folks. I go, as tough as these losses may be or how they feel, I would much rather endure the 13 seconds against Kansas City than being 4-13 and picking in the top 5 in the draft. It's much better to live out with exciting, meaningful football. Yeah.
Totally. Well, maybe Luke, we'll see you at the Commanders game week 3.
I will be there. And I'll come back to Buffalo for a game. I'm debating about possibly going to London. It seems to be a popular destination for everybody this season. So I always do a road game.
It would be fun. If you don't mind, I'll just close us with a very solemn prayer, which is God, may the Buffalo Bills win the Super Bowl in our lifetimes.
Amen. It has to happen.
Luke Russert is the author of an incredible new book, just made the New York Times bestsellers list. Details will be in the show notes. It's called Look for Me There, Grieving My Father, Finding Myself.
Makes a great Father's Day gift.
It sure does.
Exactly right.
It sure does. And Luke, great to be with you. Thanks for
thanks so much for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Well, look, I just don't think you could ask for a better Father's Day interview than that. I think that's basically the pinnacle. Love that conversation with Luke.
Yeah, it was great, and we've just been looking forward to it, and just such a nice book.
Yeah, no, I burned through that book, and. So hope you enjoyed the interview. Hope you have a wonderful Father's Day. I'm on travel. It's Father's Day. We're not going to have an episode next week. We'll return the week after. But I recommend listening to this episode multiple times. And so, hey, again, thanks as always for listening. Melissa, any closing words?
No, none.
Well, you always have one.
We know.
We always have one.
Yes. You want me to do it?
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
good? Okay, bye!